Hello and welcome to week 3 of the Occult book review. This week's book is The Woman in the Shaman's Body by Barbara Tedlock. Usually when I'm reviewing a book I take the 5-point approach of who, what, why, when and where, and it helps me break open the book and explain the themes and what the author is trying to say to people, whether that's through an article or a video like this. With this particular book, it was quite obvious from the start that the question of why was most important. Why have women been left out of the historical record when it comes to shamanism, and has that been deliberate? The way this book is written is quite dualistic in that we get a lot of Tedlock's own experiences, her own personal story, how she became a shaman herself from her relationship with her grandmother, and how after her grandmother died she began to have dream visits, and this led her along the shamanic path. But this is also a book which has a lot of academic research, and this is what Tedlock is railing against really. The amount of previous male researchers who had access to the same information as she had and saw that women were just as important within a society when it came to shamanism, and yet they chose to leave that aspect out. Instead they would call women assistants to a shaman instead of giving them that power and the authority that the actual society had given women. Now obviously this goes back further than Eliade. You can take all of the major churches and religions who have also done this, and we get great examples throughout the book of when this occurs and potentially why it occurred as well. An awful lot of it is based upon fear, the male fear of woman, the male fear of menstruation, the fear of childbirth even. So we leave Eliade behind, and even when we come to contemporary researchers, we find that, for example, in Australia in the 1980s, it was Catherine and Robert Berndt who discovered that indigenous women midwives were also shaman. They had always been called shaman, and yet up until that point historians would not give them that title, simply because they wanted to create a division. They wanted to have this male dominance even within the indigenous society, which was totally against what the indigenous people themselves were telling the researchers. We get instances of soul flight. So that was another thing that Tedlock found, that for a lot of researchers, they would break down the type of magical powers or dream powers that shaman had, and even when they would acknowledge that women were able to access certain states, they would say, for example, that, well, no, soul flight is for men only, whereas women can become possessed. And this is totally wrong, obviously, because we see all the way through the historical record that women too have been engaged in soul flight. I guess in some ways, if you go to Mongolian shamanism, you see that there are certain strands which say that they don't engage in soul flight. They call the spirits down to them instead. But once you get to know the shaman a bit more, then he or she will tell you, well, actually I do go to an upper world or a lower world, but I just don't like to tell people that because I want to protect myself and my own particular tribe. We get in the book breakdowns of various body energies, the electricity of the body, the way the body speaks, the way the fire moves through the body. And we see similarities in lots of different societies here. We see ritual descriptions of weaving, and this becomes very interesting when you look at Mesoamerica, and when you look at Asia, when you look at Australia. All of these societies have women shaman who are also midwives who teach weaving. And what I found very interesting about this is that when it comes to the Hathor cult, if you want to call it that, in Egypt, we find tattoos on the Hathor priestesses. And from a male perspective, it used to be thought that these tattoos were there simply for decoration, because the male historians saw these women as being prostitutes of the temple. But it turns out that the tattoos actually are on the abdomen at certain acupressure points. So the actual tattoos are used in order to alleviate pain for women in childbirth and during pregnancy. But where this connects to weaving is that in Mesoamerican societies, the weaving is also used, the patterns of the fingers during weaving can also be pushed upon a stomach if there was a case of an impending breech birth, for example. Later on in the book, Tedlock shows how these weaving patterns are linked to the myths of the creation stories associated with Spider-Woman. And it's funny, this is just a personal aside here, I wrote an article a while back for Ancient Origins all about how there was legends of a mythical female race in Europe going back before 5,000 years ago. And these women were supposedly able to spin the sun and bring new life into the world. And my own take on that was it was to do with stone circles, and stone circles were themselves some type of lunar calendar and a safe place for women to go to give birth. If you think about it, during hunter-gatherer society times, you didn't really have a clock, so there had to be a way for women to know when to return if you were wandering around, and it would be helpful if there were going to be women there who would help you during your time of childbirth. That's an aside, as I said. The book is full of folklore and myths from indigenous societies, from Inuit people to the Aboriginal people to Mesoamerican people. And what we see is the similarity of theme when it comes to menstruation, when it comes to fertility, when it comes to gender and sexuality, and the separation there is completely different to the way contemporary society sees it. Even the definition of androgyny itself and balance is not about being static in the middle. It's about having the fluidity to move between two states depending on what's being asked of the shaman. In this instance, we get examples where in certain tribes, if a boy at puberty was seen to be a shaman, or a girl was seen to be a shaman, but if they were out of balance, the girl would be given man's tasks and the boy would sometimes be dressed in girl's clothes and made to stay with the women until he was able to come to terms with that feminine side. And likewise, the girl was kept with the men until she was able to understand her masculine side. We also get ideas about, we touched on it slightly, spirit flight, but the creation of spiritual life. And this is something that ties again into midwifery, because the shaman was not just, the female shaman was not just seen as someone who could bring in physical life into the world. She was someone that could bring in spiritual life. So this potentially ties into the idea of witches' familiars, and that idea, and we also get a breakdown of different types of utensils that the shaman would have, and we see the evolution of staffs and sticks up to a wand, and then possibly the broom, and riding again into the spiritual night. At the end of the book, Tedlock is cautiously optimistic, I would say. She asks us to reassess the role of women and shamanism, and she asks us to take the good things from Eliade, certainly, but to understand that the historical record is skewed in this instance. So we definitely need to rewrite the role of women and shamanism. And what I got from it as well is that there is no separation between witch, shaman, sorceress. All of these terms are transient cultural, what would you say, antiques at this point. We need to let them go, because when you're talking about shamanism and you're talking about traveling, you're talking about hedge witchery, you're tapping into something beyond the physical anyway. So cultures don't really matter. It's the scenery you pass by to get to the higher place, if you like. And this is what Tedlock demonstrates again and again, because you see the Inuit people, the Australian Aboriginal people, the Mongolian people, the African people, it's all the same place that they're tapping into, but they're using their own cultural experiences to navigate by, but they say goodbye to the physical world and they enter their dream world, their imaginary world, their upper world, whatever you want to call it. So actually I read recently The Good People by Hannah Kent, which is about an Irish experience of this hedge witch, the woman living outside the village who helps with fertility, childbirth. And again, I suppose there's a good allegory there because she's persecuted by the church and the new priest arriving. And I would recommend that book as well, actually, to go along with this particular one. But The Woman in the Shaman's Body, highly recommended, written by Barbara Tedlock. See you next week.